Okay, if you'll give me just a moment, I'm going to get us set up. I'm going to share my screen for you, and then we'll get started. Okay, does that look, can everyone see the full screen?
Looks great, Ashley. Thank you.
Great. Awesome. All right, well, welcome everyone. Hopefully you've enjoyed some morning sessions at Engage OK in the Cloud. We're excited that you joined us this afternoon for Foundational Strategies of Culturally Responsive Teaching. My name is Ashley Moore. I'm the Director of Gifted and Talented Programs at the State Department.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Chrisman. I am part of the Oklahoma Excel team, and I serve as the ELA instructional specialist. So we're happy that you were joining us today. All right, as we get started today, if you could rename yourself to include your name and what district you are from. In order to rename yourself, you can find your picture icon, and in the top right corner, there are 3 little dots that you can click, and it will drop down a menu, and you can select rename. So for example, you can see that I have Andrea Chrisman at Oklahoma State Department of Education. If you could please keep your microphone muted to support everyone's ability to hear today, we would really appreciate it. And Dawn Irons is moderating the chat box. So if you have chat box, please, if you have questions, please include them in the chat box. The 2 tech tools we will be using today during our session are Padlet and Jamboard. We will go through those a little bit later on in the session and how to use them. And so we're going to go ahead and get started today with a Zoom poll. So it's just one quick question. If you could tell us who is joining us today. Give me just a second, we'll pull it up. Ashley and Dawn, are you able to see the poll?
Do you want me to hit launch?
Yeah, go ahead and launch it, sorry.
Okay, there you go. I just hit launch poll. So hopefully that's coming through to everyone.
And it looks like we are still waiting for just about 10 more folks to respond.
Okay, thank you, Dawn.
Oh, great, thanks. Erica, let's see. You said you don't see the poll. Can everybody else see the poll?
Yes, it looks like the attendees are now viewing the poll results. And it looks like, Ashley and Andrea, we have 75% of those of us who are in attendance today are teachers. We don't have any school counselors with us, but we do have 12 administrators or school leaders. We have one person who identifies themselves as a member of school staff. And then we have 4 folks from the community who are joining us this afternoon.
Excellent. Great. We're so excited to have you all with us today. Really quickly, we're going to go over the session outcomes. So by the end of the session, you will have a clearer understanding of culturally responsive teaching. You will be aware of excellent resources for culturally responsive teaching practices. You will know the foundational beliefs behind culturally responsive teaching. We will be participating in learning culturally responsive teaching strategies in our classrooms. And then we are going to share current strategies that are inclusive of all students.
Great. So as we begin our session, I know that, it's great to hear such a variety of educational experiences are here today. I think that's awesome because we all come with different perspectives. So as we're going through this session, we can kind of keep a few things in mind, focusing on the idea, seeking to learn from each other and from the session, hopefully, embracing different perspectives, challenging ourselves on how we can incorporate any parts of this into our classroom. And that's kind of what we hope you take away is even just 1 or 2 strategies that you could even implement in your classroom is great, or in your school, or even in your community for our community members is a great thing to take away. Engaging in meaningful and solution-focused discourse. And then we have an opportunity here in just a minute for you to take some notes and just kind of keep track of some things that resonate with you, and even following up on those notes as a reflection. Our agenda today, we've already knocked out 2 of these, which is great. The introduction to housekeeping, going over the norms in our agenda today. We're going to hear a short clip from Zaretta Hammond herself. We're going to read a few articles and reflect on those, and then actually dig into our culture responsive practices and strategies, and then talk about the outcomes and share our ideas that we're either already implementing in our classroom or things that we would like to implement in our classroom.
All right, so these are some of the things that we know to be true for all students. Culturally responsive teaching is a best practice for all students, and that all students are capable of academic success. We also know that teachers must have high expectations for all students, and students need to see themselves and their communities reflected and valued in their classrooms. So please keep these things in mind today as we go through some of these culturally responsive practices.
Great, so we'll start with a definition of culture responsive teaching, kind of get us all on the same page. So this comes from Zaretta Hammond's book, Culture Responsive Teaching in the Brain. I'm not sure if any of you have read that. It's a great book that gives a lot of neuroscience, but this is where the definition is pulled from. And so there are 4 bullet points that we'll kind of highlight, and then even more specifically, the outcomes are highlighted in orange for you on the screen. But culture responsive teaching is helping culturally and linguistically diverse students who have been marginalized in school build their skill and capacity to do rigorous work. So really that outcome of building their skill and capacity to do rigorous work. Recognizing students' cultural displays of learning and meaning making, and responding positively and constructively with teaching moves that use cultural knowledge. Connecting what the student knows to new concepts and content in order to promote effective information processing. That's a point you're going to hear linked to often in our session today, is how do we promote information processing? And that's one of the major reasons we have culturally responsive teaching practices. Understanding the importance of being in a relationship and having a social emotional connection to the students in order to create a safe space for learning. That important social emotional connection with our students, we will talk more about that. And of course, The effect of that is creating a safe space for learning for all students.
Okay, so in order to set the stage even further for today's presentation, we're going to watch a short portion of a Zaretta Hammond video. Zaretta Hammond is a leader in culturally responsive pedagogy. In this clip, she's presenting at the San Francisco Library, and she discusses her life experiences and the life experiences she had growing up in the projects of Hunters Point, a community in San Francisco. She also talks about her commute from Hunters Point to the more affluent Richmond district for school, and the difference between her education and how her life experiences informed her knowledge, and specifically her background knowledge. As we watch, be thinking of a life experience that has impacted your role as an educator and how it has informed your practice with students. We are going to watch a short portion of this, and then we're going to respond in the chat box. So give us just a second, and Ashley will start the video.
Awesome. Sorry. Let's see. Okay.
Now, my mother worked in the San Francisco public library system for 30 years. She wasn't a librarian. She was a library technician. And she was part of the CEDAR program, the very first welfare to work program. And they put her in a branch library, Noe Valley. And when it was time for us to come home, we'd take the bus and we'd go to the branch. And she'd fill the table with books. And she said, when you hit the table, you've read all these books, it's time to go home. That was my after school program. And now that I'm, an adult, I can reflect on how rich an experience that was. That lit my curiosity, my intellectual curiosity, and what we know when we start to talk about that equality versus equity. How do we get the equity? We know getting children's brains fired up so that those brain cells grow is the only way we're going to start closing achievement gaps. And I started to have that experience, and indirectly, my mother didn't know she was firing my brain up. All she knew was she was keeping us, focused while she could finish out her job. Now, I remember the day I asked her, could I go over to the adult section? Because I'd read everything in the children's section. She gave me the side eye. Like, I know what's over there. And and she said, go ahead. And oh, here's the learning target. Here's what we were working toward.
Sorry about that. It jumps straight ahead.
I can reflect on how rich an experience that was. That lit my curiosity, my intellectual curiosity, and what we know when we start to talk about that equality versus equity. How do we get the equity? We know getting children's brains fired up so that those brain cells grow is the only way we're going to start closing achievement gaps. And I started to have that experience, and indirectly, my mother didn't know she was firing my brain up. All she knew was she was keeping us, focused while she could finish out her job. Now, I remember the day I asked her, could I go over to the adult section? Because I'd read everything in the children's section. She gave me the side eye. Like, I know what's over there. And and she said, go ahead. And a whole world opened up. I learned about mythology and geology and all this stuff that now we would talk about a child needed because it builds background knowledge. You start to make connections. Those connections stimulate the brain. And when we start to talk about what closes achievement gaps, that's really what we're looking for. What ways do we stimulate children's brains, beginning in early education, so that they are lifelong learners with intellectual curiosity versus just being compliant in schools? So the work that I do really is around helping people understand that closing achievement gaps, getting to equity is not a matter of what's the new strategy, but how do we actually get kids' brains on fire? Because only the learner learns. So the degree to which we can get the child fired up about learning is the only way we're going to get them college and career ready.
All right, so we're going to take 2 to 3 minutes, and I would like for you to respond in the chat and let us know how a life experience, or think of a life experience, and how it's impacted your role as an educator, and then how has that informed your practice with students. So I'm going to go ahead and set a quick timer. We'll take 2 to 3 minutes to respond in the chat. Yeah, I love that I'm seeing it. So many of you are saying that a past teacher in your life influenced the way that you now think about teaching and how you work with your students. I'm connecting with some people that say that they've taken some time to travel and be abroad and have learned from other cultures that way, which is great. Oh, I love that I'm seeing that that connection that you had with the teacher was really powerful for you. We're going to get into that a little bit later in this session. So I'm excited to hear more about that later on. Looks like we have about 28 more seconds.
There's so many good ones coming in. I'm trying to read them all. I hope you have a chance as well to read some of your colleagues' responses. There's some great ones highlighting the role of teachers, also highlighting the role of family members and the importance of books. We know that, and then yet some people talking about how much they've absorbed just reading, and that's amazing. Kind of also what Zaretta Hammond experienced as well. The traveling really resonates with me. I've done a lot of traveling, and man, that just changes your mindset. So I love that a couple of people commented on that.
Excellent. Keep those responses coming. I'm really excited to continue to read more about you and your life experiences and how they have informed your instruction. We're going to go ahead and let me make sure my timer is not going to go off again. Okay. We are going to go ahead and move into thinking a little bit more about the levels of culturally responsive practice. I'm going to be clicking through a continuum that shows the different levels of culturally responsive practice. And as we go through these different levels, please be thinking about where you are and where you might fall on this continuum. We want to make sure that we honor that we all have different levels of experience and contexts with this work. So, at the left of the continuum, we have eliminating aspects of other cultures. And if we move forward to the next level,
Sorry.
we have believing and behaving in ways that assert superiority of a culture while disrespecting and devaluing other people's cultures. This next level is believing or acting as if other cultural differences do not matter. And as I continue to go through these, please be thinking about like where you fall and what the next step might be for you. So recognizing limitations of one's skills or practices to meet the needs of others. And then behaving in ways and enacting policies that lead to a bias-free environment or environments that are respectful of diverse backgrounds. And then drawing on diverse backgrounds, strengths and challenges to deepen our learning or students' learning. And then at the far right side of the continuum, we have seeking to foster and explicitly support students' diverse backgrounds, their identities, their strengths, and their challenges. So as we move forward, please be thinking about where you fall and how you can push yourself to that next level so that we can really work to support all students and their diverse backgrounds.
Okay, so we're going to take a minute and do a little bit of reading kind of to see the different elements and aspects of culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy. So kind of based on the video and everything we've talked about so far, we're going to go to a Padlet here in just a moment. I'm sure Dawn will put a link to that in the chat box for us, but there are going to be 3 different articles. We'd like for you to choose one of those 3 articles. If you'd like kind of a little summary to know which one might be the one you want to read. The first article, if you want more information on like equity or why culture responsive teaching is a facet of educational equity, that would be article 1 would be a good one for you. It's from Zaretta Hammond herself. Article 2, if you want more information on what culturally responsive teaching is and what it is not, that might be, especially if you're new to this and kind of like Andrea just was kind of showing us, maybe not even really sure where you are on that continuum, this might be a really good one for you. And then article 3, if you just like more information on maybe next steps to culturally responsive teaching, like I kind of know what it is and what should I do next, that would be a good article for you to read. So you can jump over the Padlet. We'll take 10 minutes to read, and then we'd love for you to respond to the article that you read by just making a comment underneath, or you can just click on it and add a comment. You are also welcome to read other people's comments, and if you like one, maybe there's something that someone says resonates with you, you can hit the little heart, which is the like button. So we'll go ahead and give you 10 minutes to do this. Okay, let's see if I can get this stuff. Very good. Awesome. All right, great. We've had some great comments over here on the Padlet. And I hope you had a chance to go through and maybe like some of the ones that you resonated with you. I think that will give us some good feedback and some good discourse on them. If you're still working or still want to take a moment to think before you add the Padlet, that's totally fine. We understand that as well. It'll be up and running this whole session. So I will get us back to maybe. Sorry. Alrighty, very good. Thank you so much for reading those and sharing your thoughts and your responses with each other. We're going to move on now to the strategies component, right? The reason why you hopefully came to this session to learn some foundational basics for culture responsive teaching. We're going to talk about 5 areas of culture responsive practices that you can do in your classroom. Of course, you can take these into your school as a whole or into your community as well, but we're kind of focusing more specifically in the classroom. With each of these areas, you'll see we'll talk about 2 things. We're going to talk about the explanation of it. We're also going to talk about strategies to implement in your classroom as well. We also have a response document that you might be interested in following along with. So in this response document, for each one of these, it has a place for you to take notes. It also has a place for you to, if you hear an idea that you're like, oh, I could do that in my classroom. That sounds like something I would like to do. There's a place for you to jot that down on the note-taking guide. It also has some extra resources and things we'll talk about later in the session. So hopefully you have the ability to, Dawn's put a link to that in the chat box for you. You do have to make a copy of it because we can't all type on the same one. But anyway, so we'll get started with these strategies. Hang on, Andrew, I think you're muted.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry. So the first strategy for culturally responsive practice is being able to access students' prior knowledge. The Zaretta Hammond video gave you an example of how her life experiences shaped her knowledge. And we asked you more specifically to think about how your life experiences have shaped your teaching practice. With that to end, we know that all people and students benefit from using their background knowledge and life experiences to connect to their learning. And that teachers should be able to provide multiple access points for challenging assignments and tasks. So some of these considerations are that all learners process information best when it is linked to something that we already know. By doing this, students have a better understanding of the context or a reference point to start new learning. And then I noticed a lot of you in the Padlet said that you've been thinking about students' cultural backgrounds. And as educators, we must be aware of that because students from culturally diverse backgrounds can provide context in ways that inform their classmates and your instruction. So kids are able to explain kid things better than we are oftentimes. And then we know that background knowledge shapes students' comprehension of the world around them. Something that I really love is that educators must provide mirrors that reflect their students' own familiar identity and also allow for windows that help them see into other cultures, traditions, and the history of many other groups. And then one thing that Zaretta Hammond talks about in her book is that our brain's neural pathways are strengthened when learning is connected to something we already know and with music, movements, visuals, and different types of realia. So these are some of the things that we know about how prior knowledge can be accessed. And then we're gonna move forward and look at some of the things that we can do in our own classrooms to support this. So one easy way to access students' prior knowledge is by using a KWL chart. So this is a really easy strategy. So in order to do this, you would divide a whiteboard or chart paper into 3 columns labeled know, want to know, and learned. And by filling out the know column, you're able to discover students' background knowledge. And then after you access that prior knowledge, give them an opportunity to share what they want to know about the same topic. This really helps build students' curiosity. And then at the end of the unit, you can get a quick assessment of things that they have learned and the information that they have gathered and the knowledge they've grown. A second way that you can access prior knowledge is by using a kinesthetic anticipation guide. So this allows for students to explore their opinions on a topic before a unit of study. So kids are able to get up out of their chairs and move around, and they can maybe place themselves on like a continuum based on a question that you've asked. And they can go from agree to disagree and kind of sort themselves that way. Another thing that teachers can do in their classroom to access prior knowledge is by giving like a 4 corners activity where students can go into like agree, strongly disagree, strongly disagree. And then by that, you're figuring out kind of the question that they have around a unit of study. Something that's really important is being able to provide resources in a student's home language. Students may have certain knowledge or ways to explain something in their home language that they aren't fully able to articulate in English. So giving kids think time and time to process in their home language not only is validating their families and their prior knowledge, but it makes it allows them to have time to figure out something to connect to. Another way is by showing images that relate to the topic, and all students are able to benefit from visuals such as short videos and photos. And help them connect to that related learning and ask questions to help them clarify their thinking and spark curiosity. And then provide opportunities for student discussion. Students can help one another build understanding and comprehension of a subject, especially when they are able to make connections with one another. And then one way that is really strong for all kids is being able to front load vocabulary. You can do this for a unit, for a book. You can use pictures, definitions, and different context examples. So with some of those things in mind, I know that was a lot of talking at you, but I hope that you're able to we'll take just like a minute, and I would like for you to put into the document that Ashley talked about a couple slides ago, and I would love for you to be able to think about something you learned or one way that you are looking forward to implementing this in your classroom moving forward.
All right, very good. Thank you. Don put again a link to that note taker. It's just a way for you to kind of, as we're going through these, like Andrea just said, she gave us a lot of great information. So we can put, if there's any ideas that come to you, like, hey, I do that. That's great. You can put those and jot those down there. So the second strategy we're going to talk about is in regard to curriculum and instruction, which that is a huge topic. We could probably just have one engaged session on culture responsive teaching and curriculum instruction on its own. So we're going to try to give you a really broad overview here. When we're thinking about curriculum, there are several things we can consider. First of all, we can look at what we present. So when you're looking at your curriculum, what is the content? And so you're looking at what you're presenting as as your content. You can also look at how you present it. So what strategies are you using? And of course, we're going to give you a ton today. That's Andrea already gave you a bunch. We're going to continue to go through. You're going to see a lot of crossover in some of these sections as well. But how you present it. So that's important, right? As we're accessing prior knowledge or moving on to the tasks we ask students to do. What kind of resources are you using? Can you use a variety of media, perspectives, books, film, digital content that brings in other voices, of diverse voices into your classroom, of diverse experiences, especially those that represent your students and those that represent especially your community? Thinking about who we are teaching. Of course, we're teaching our students, so we want to consider who our students represent, the families they represent, the cultures they represent, but also who we are teaching in our content is especially important. So can we choose diverse voices within our content and within our subject? Oftentimes that's something that even if we meet with our team or our content or subject areas, we can come up with a good list of people of voices we can bring in. So those are all considerations, pretty broad considerations when we're talking about curriculum. When we think about instruction, and let me talk about who we are teaching as well. So it says cultural archetypes. I know sometimes that when we think about, well, I've got a lot of diverse cultures represented in my classroom. How can I know all of those? Well, sometimes one easier way a place to begin might be to think about, who might my students be who represent more Eastern cultures or collectivist cultures. Those are very different from those students who may be from Western cultures or more individualistic cultures. And so even just starting there with how do I teach students who represent those voices and bring in those voices that represent those cultures, it's a great place to begin. Considerations for instruction. So again, I've kind of given you the this or that, and I've highlighted obviously the preference here for you. Relevance versus lack of context, as we've already mentioned. Zaretta mentioned it herself in her video. Relevance. We know that our students who, when they are engaged and their brains are fired up because something is relevant to them, they make that connection. We know that they're much more engaged in their learning versus having a lack of context, no way of knowing where this comes from. Challenge and stretch. When we have high expectations of all of our students, their brains stretch. That's how they grow. And versus watered down, whether it's watered down curriculum or watered down tasks, whatever that might be. The ultimate goal is to build independent learners who, that's where we get the lifelong learning as well. Like we want these learners to not just depend on us or a teacher, but to be able to go ask the questions, to know where to go to find the answers and to problem solve and to think critically. And ultimately, authentic learning is one way to get there. So providing these authentic learning experiences for students where they can ask the questions, find the answers, respond in those meaningful ways that builds on their cultural lens or builds on what their background, just provides them so much more than traditional learning does. So in practice, what can that look like? Again, there's so many different ways. I'm sure you do so many of these. We're going to talk big picture again when we talk about scope and sequence of instruction. So 4 main kind of big areas. When we look at igniting or getting the brain's attention, you heard Zaretta Hammond mention that, like my brain was fired up. This is really scaffolding, like interest inventories or those pre-assessment things that we do. Andrea mentioned several of those. Chunking information, so taking new information and putting those in digestible chunks, whether that's through color-coded charts or non-linguistic representations, graphics, all kinds of things like that. The actively processing new information. We can do that in a variety of ways. That can be through story making, similarities and differences, finding relationships, metaphor building, analogy creation, wordplay, humor, games. There's so many different ways like that you probably already use in your classroom. And you didn't realize even that those ways help students to just really process the new information in a different way. And then reviewing it, having a chance to apply new learning. And I'd even add one more, an assessment would be one I'd add to this almost. Like, how are we assessing students so that they have a way to show what they've learned? So we're going to take a second now, go back over to that note catcher. And if something is something you already do or something you're like, I think I should do that in my classroom this year, go ahead and jot that down in the next 30 seconds or so.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. The next thing that we're going to talk about is considering your classroom environment. So what does your classroom environment look like, feel like, sound like, and how can we include culturally responsive teaching in those ways? So one really strong way is to make sure that these culturally responsive practices are woven into your instruction. They should be used regularly and not as one of those like one-off, like, oh, I'm taking this one thing and I'm going to do it in my class and there, I've done culturally responsive teaching. Make sure that these things are part of your everyday practice. Another way to encourage social interaction is to create classroom norms that you establish with students so that students feel invested in those norms that you've created for your classroom. When you have strong classroom norms, students are able to take more risks in their learning when they're in an environment where they feel safe and valued. And then being aware and sensitive to students' mental and physical transitions between home and school. We know that kids come from all kinds of home situations and backgrounds, and a classroom should be a place where routines are established, rituals are there, and they're closely adhered to so that students know what to expect when they walk into your classroom. And in addition to that, a culturally responsive classroom environment goes beyond decorating the walls with cultural artifacts. It should be an emotionally stable and responsive environment. Those things are important to include on your walls, but it should be more than that. And another way that really helps students of all ages is making sure that your classroom is organized so that the physical space can be used by all students. So organize the classroom so that the space has images and charts and materials that are easily able to be accessed, because students will learn how to use each of those areas in your classrooms to know where to look for the visuals that they need to be able to seek help, or they know where they can go to get the materials that they need to complete an assignment. So keeping all of those things in mind, we're going to talk about a couple of things that you can do in your classroom. So many stories, many of our children come from places where oral tradition is very strong and highly valued. So use those cultural tools that you find in oral tradition, such as repetition, songs, puzzle solving, making connections, chants, and movement. And then allow time for students to talk and share constructively. This not only allows for all students to build more prior knowledge and build knowledge as you go along, it allows for students to practice talking in their home language maybe, and then building vocabulary in English, and being able to talk to one another in a safe space. One way that I love, and I love this phrase, make things sticky. So build in a lesson hook with an essential question that sparks curiosity, or use a short video. When you show videos, you arouse curiosity, and students are more are more engaged and able to have like a visual to connect to. Create a warm welcome by greeting students as they enter your classroom. This is a practice called threshold. And then I'm sure some of you have seen some of those like really cool YouTube videos or things on Facebook where teachers like make different handshakes and chants with kids. But by using this, by using threshold, you're able to reset expectations for your class during the day, and you're able to make a quick connection with each student as they enter the room. This will also help you have a calmer beginning to your classroom learning time. And then think about those consistent routines and rituals like we talked about a little bit earlier. Every kid needs to feel safe, and kids need to know what to expect. And if it's picture day and something ends up changing the schedule, make sure that kids have that advance notice so that they know what to expect if something's going to change. And then create an environment that is socially and intellectually safe. I think I've talked about that many times in this slide, but this allows for students to take more academic risk, and it builds confidence. And then as educators, we must acknowledge effort and instruct and model growth mindset for all kids. So that said, go ahead and go back to that note catcher. What is one way that you can consider the environment of your classroom in culturally responsive teaching? I'll give you just a couple seconds to jot some ideas down, and then Ashley will be talking to us about student voice and choice.
All right, we'll go ahead and start talking about student voice and choice. So when we talk about this, there's several things we're going to talk about with student voice and choice. It's probably one of my favorite parts of the culture responsive practices, because if you were asking me, I like to talk and I like my independence. So I know that through language and through talking, allowing students to speak and then to choose and to make choices for their own learning gives them agency and helps improve their independence, to take them from dependent learners to independent learners. And we know how important that is. We talked about that earlier. So social talk and academic talk structures are both important, and yet they're a little bit different. So building like this social talk, I think Andrea just talked about that a little bit, allowing students to have time to have conversations that happen more than just outside on the playground or at lunch is really important, especially when they're in classroom together. And academic talk structures, which encourage them to speak in class about a topic that just helps them not to build relationships with themselves, which is great, but also with the teacher, and the teacher can be part of those academic talk structures as well. We'll talk about that in a second. Our brains are wired for connection. That's really how our brains learn and grow. We've said that so many times. Those authentic experiences, that learning that I can say, hey, well, what about this? Can I look into this more? That's an authentic. When I can take something that's sparked in class and ask a question, then go find the answer or go respond to it, it just helps me. That's the challenge and stretch through that authentic experience. And that's what we're trying to provide for our students. Those can happen organically, but they can also happen with good lesson structure, as we talked about earlier. So one thing as teachers, or really any educators, we want to make sure we're doing is being intentional about using asset-based thinking and language with all of our students. So whether we're talking to another teacher about a student, or whether we're just in our classroom, having these strength mindset is really what I like to consider it, because all of our students have these assets and have these strengths, and they come from families who want them to do well and who want to see them, improving and doing so well. So that's just an important part of this. Assessment and feedback. So really, when I say assessment, I'm kind of talking about formative assessment here. We know summative assessment, but we can't always get the information and time on that to get back to students. So formative assessment becomes actually really important. And we know, especially coming into this next school year, the importance of formative assessment. And then to provide feedback to students that's helpful. So not just hey, you did it, you turned it in, that's great. That's not necessarily as helpful, but to help this academic growth mindset. And on that note catcher, there's actually a diagram, a chart on there that you might want to read into. It links to this as well. But providing feedback is part of that. Part of building the teacher-student relationship is providing this feedback that's beneficial, that it's timely, that gives direction, that's not just a whole list of things they've done wrong, but is one or two points where they can improve. And then, of course, they can reflect on that, and students can make improvements, which is growth. And then, of course, academic conversation experiences. I know in my classroom, we did that a lot. I know many of you do that in your classrooms, but helping students to not just talk to each other, but reflect and respond to their own learning. What have you learned? And what does that mean? Even having, we have parent-teacher conferences. Why not a student-teacher conference or student-parent conference? Those kinds of things that help students remember that they are also in charge of their learning. And with that, so we'll talk about what does this look like in practice. We've already talked about a few examples, but digital storytelling and report talk, those are very similar. Those are great ways, allowing students to respond or produce work that allows them to use their cultural lens. This is where choice comes in. Instead of just having one option for an assessment, allowing several different options for students that they can choose, that not only lets them choose what their interests them, but also allowing them to use their cultural lens, their background, their experience, their interests, what you've sparked already, that they can use that when they're responding or producing an assessment or work of some kind. Creating space for alternate explanations. I mean, the easy one to think of is in, English language arts, right? With creating another end to a story or a what happened next type of situation where they can use their imaginations. But there's so many different ways in other subjects areas where we can create space for this, like alternate explanations for things. Obviously, rapport and affirmation build trust, and building trust in culture responsive classrooms is so important. And that's part of student voice, allowing students to speak, and allowing them to have opinions and personalities and all that. It builds trust, which helps them learn. Giving feedback, we just talked about this, that is instructive, specific, timely, and actionable. I love those 4 words because it tells me exactly the kind of feedback that I need to give as a teacher, and that will help my students to grow. And it holds them to those high expectations. I'm not going to just let anything go. Just because you turned it in doesn't mean it was perfect, but how do we learn from those? The assignments we're turning in or the work we're doing. And then having students respond to each other using sentence stems. So teaching them how to speak to each other, especially when we're talking about certain parts of learning. Maybe it's peer editing, or maybe it's actual conversations about, maybe they're having a debate or whatever that might be, but using stems like, I agree when you said this, but, or I like that you said this, but, or I thought this, having those academic stems can also be very helpful. So go ahead, take a moment, go back to your note catcher, jot down 1 or 2 maybe ideas. Maybe you already do them. Maybe you see something here, you're like, I could do that. That would fit into my curriculum. Also, you might take a second to look at that academic mindset chart and see where some of this, especially that feedback portion, fits in.
All right, I hope you guys were able to jot down some of those really great ideas that Ashley shared. Now we're going to be moving into building student-teacher relationships. This is something that I think is so important and valuable when thinking about culturally responsive teaching. I noticed that some of you in the Jamboard earlier, or in the Padlet earlier, mentioned that it's so important to build those relationships with kids, because if you don't have that trust, you're not going to be able to help them move forward. So one thing we know and must believe is that all students can achieve at high levels. By holding those high expectations for students, you're conveying confidence in them. Teachers that have high expectations, they focus on effort and set really rigorous and achievable goals so that students feel successful in the classroom, and they also feel like there is an adult that really cares about them. To build relationships with students, we must understand that the way that culture influences communication styles, both verbally and non-verbally. Some cultures really appreciate it when you look them in the eyes and give that proximity. Some other cultures, that is not something that they view as positive. So be really those archetypes that Ashley was talking about earlier, being really cognizant of that as you're working with students. It's really important to be intentional and self-aware. So investigate your own cultural identity in order to seek how you can be more inclusive in your teaching practices. Create a learning partnership that seeks to build trust between the students, to create a social emotional connection for deeper learning. And something to think about is the whole child. So in many cases, students spend more of their waking hours with you than they do with their families. So caring about the whole child is so important to build strong relationships and therefore improve outcomes with kids. So some of the things that you can do to build these relationships are to create and build authentic relationships. It's really important that you show that you care and that you remember the things that they tell you, and making sure that kids know that you really care about them. So thinking about that, not like no one size fits all well, right? All kids are different and they need to be honored as an individual. So as you're getting to know them, you need to honor and validate how they feel and listen carefully to what they're telling you, because they're kids. They're going to tell you how they're feeling and what's going on. That's one of the great things about students, is that they're very honest most of the time. Get to know more about their families, their households, the community. You can do this during morning meetings, or if you're monitoring recess or lunch, you can engage with them and then therefore learn a little bit more about their families and the things that they enjoy. And you can use that to build really rich curriculum and activities and assignments in your classroom. One thing that I love to do every year was to give an interest inventory. So just a small questionnaire that asks things such as, what excites or motivates you? Or what's your favorite holiday? Why do you like that holiday? How do you spend that with your family? Who lives with you? Who are those really important relationships in your life? Does your name have a special meaning? Do you have a nickname? So just some ways to learn a little bit more about them. I know many of us will create those and it's like, what's your favorite book? Which is really important, but also thinking about like, how do you ask them questions that can really help them, like how you can connect with them on a more personal level. So these are a couple of ideas. I'm sure that you all have many, many more that you know about and already use, but take a minute and write down any of those ways that you can build those teacher-student relationships in your classroom.
Great. So we've talked through 5 big strategies, probably major categories that had strategies within them. So what are the positive outcomes when it comes to, like, if someone said, why culture responsive teaching? Why are these practices important? What do they do? Although they're not always all quantifiable, they really do a lot of different, they have a lot of positive outcomes, honestly. We know that they lessen achievement gaps. And so whether it's unfinished learning, whether it's just achievement gaps for whatever reason, we know that these have positive outcomes in that area. They ignite the brain so students can not just learn, but they can reach their full potential. It helps to build relationships between teachers and students. And honestly, even more than that, when we have teachers and students who have great relationships, teachers then can foster relationships with families. And that just, it creates a higher investment in academics. And so then families and students become involved in their learning. And we know that that can make great changes for students as well. That partnership is so essential. Motivating and engaging all students. When students, we know when they're attentive and they're engaged, there's no telling how much they can learn. Which facilitates brain processing. I mean, that's all part of it, right? Promote a sense of safety and belonging. We know we want that, but that is definitely a positive outcome of culture responsive teaching. And then we strengthen students' racial and ethnic identities. We know that all of our students, they're trying to build their identities while they're in our classroom, trying to learn all of these things. No matter what age they are, they're growing, they're maturing, they're developing in whatever ways. But we also want our students to be able to build their racial and ethnic identities as well. And so this is one way that allows them the freedom to do that. So, all right.
Okay, something I've loved is during the session is being able to watch the chat and see that you guys are sharing ideas and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna add that to my notes. So we wanna take some time now to compile all of the things that you've been writing down or that you've been discussing in the chat. That way we have a resource that we can all come back to as we, enter into next year, because we know that school's still a couple months or a month-ish, a month and a half away, so that you might forget some of these things. We want you to be able to look back and be like, oh yeah, I remember that was something I wanted to start incorporating in my classroom. So we've created a Jamboard. Dawn will include, or it looks like she's already included that in the chat box. So we would like to compile a resource base for you, like I said, to be able to use next year. We ask that you include ways that you already use culturally responsive teaching in your classroom, or things that you've jotted down that you might want to try next year that you've never used before. As a note, the Jamboard is divided into 5 different slides, 1 slide for each of the topics that we have touched on today. So find a slide that most closely relates to an idea or something you'd like to share. And then to add a new note, over on the left-hand side, there is a little Post-it icon. And once you click that, it'll allow you to start typing in that little sticky note. So we're going to take a few minutes. I would love for you to start sharing resources. The more you can add, the better, so that we all have some ideas moving into next year. And as a side note, Ashley and I did include a couple of ideas that we already had, just to give you like a starting place.
There's so many good ideas on the Jamboard. So if you're still writing a note, please make sure you write one or two. We've got great ones on every slide here. So take a second. If you've written one, go ahead and read some of the ones written here. There's some great ideas. I love that some of you are already thinking about this or already implementing some of these in your classroom. I'll give you about 30 more seconds to finish up. I hope you were able to take a moment to read some of the other comments made and ideas. And of course, you can jot those down on your paper too, on your note catcher. You'll actually see an example of what, so what, now what on your note catcher, response document, whatever you want to call it. It's toward the bottom, and it is a strategy. It is culture responsive, although it's maybe not. Sometimes we think it has to be cultural specific, but that's not always the case. It asks you, what did you learn? And so now what are you going to do with that? Now that you've learned it, and well, what did you learn? Why is it important? What does it mean to you? And then now what are you going to do with it? So it gives you a chance to actually participate in a strategy. If you want to, you're welcome to do that on your note catcher. You don't have to, it's not required, but we're not taking up your papers. But so as we talk about next steps, there's several things we can talk about. First of all, consider who you might engage in further conversations about culturally responsive teaching with. Maybe you work at a school that has school teams, so maybe grade level teams, maybe it's subject or content area teams. That's a great place to have these conversations as you're talking, especially about curriculum and instruction. Sometimes those things are better talked about in a group or with colleagues. It could be with administration, families, maybe there's other partners in your district that you can have these conversations with. We hope that you are able to choose one or two strategies from this session to implement into your classroom instruction this year. As Andrea mentioned at the beginning, we're all starting in different places coming to this session. So we hope that maybe you just, wherever you are, you just take another step further on the continuum just to make improvements in some way. That's just our hope. Think through the reflection questions. There are reflection questions on your response document. We would love for you to think through those and what they mean for your classroom and in your job and position. And then, of course, we've given you some links to some further reading on culture responsive practices. If you are interested in this topic and want to know more, you have a link to the other articles as well if you want to read those. So those are just some next steps if you're interested.
All right, so we have just a couple last minute resources for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, when I introduced myself, I am part of the Oklahoma Excel team. I'm the ELA instructional specialist. So I just wanted to share this opportunity with you all. Oklahoma Excel is a networked improvement community that provides job embedded, collaborative, year-long professional learning. Things that I've heard from some of my teammates that it has been some of the most helpful and the best professional development that they have participated in. So with that said, we've extended our deadline to July 2nd. I believe Dawn is probably going to put in the chat the link to the bit.ly, or you can go ahead and type that in right now. And we focus in 4 different areas: ELA, math, science, and we have a new early childhood education networked improvement community. We still have professional development awards available So this can help offset any of the costs that your school might incur, but this is a free professional development. So if you have more questions or want more information, there is our SDE website information. So I would love to have some of you that are here with us today go ahead and join the Excel team.
All right, very good. Thank you, Andrea. And one more plug for Ready Together Oklahoma. I am sure that you've already heard about this, but we want to make sure that you have. We don't want you to be left out, and we want to make sure you know where to go for the resources. Ready Together Oklahoma is the action plan for any unfinished learning after the pandemic. And it's not just for this next year after the pandemic. The great thing about it is that it will cover the next several years, actually, which is great. It includes statewide initiatives, guidance documents, resources, and webinars. And what I love even more is that it's timely. So there are already documents under these different headings listed, and then you can see the ones that are coming. And they have these great little banners at the top that say like new or upcoming or something. So it's great. So you can check it often. Dawn has put a link to it, to the website in the chat box. If you've not had a chance to go and just kind of play around with what's on there, some really great resources, and they're in briefs. They're like 2-pagers, which is wonderful. So you're not having to read thousands of pages worth of stuff, but they're in these digestible chunks, which are so great for us since we all, I know, or don't necessarily have time to read a ton all the time. So we hope you have a chance to look at that. Our last thing, and then we'll let you go. And there is a link to the PD certificate. Dawn put that in the chat box because she is awesome. We're thankful for her help today. And these are some of the references from our presentation. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us at Engage OK in the Cloud. We appreciate you and all that you do for our students in Oklahoma. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for attending. And I hope that you have a great afternoon and rest of your day.